Morning, fellow zombies. Still 08 in the morning, West Coast time, Tuesday, the 27th of August, 2024. They're barely alive and barely awake. Zombie Weaver, John C. of Roseman, California. Huh? Shout out to the Young Turks trying to get a story right concerning about the Boeing spacecraft Starliner. So what was being told in the news conference on Saturday? They're expressing some doubt. Boeing Company is expressing some doubt whether or not the ship is space worthy enough to fly the two astronauts home. Sorry, had to do that. And the issue is because of the thrusters, at least 5 of the maneuvering thrusters that this thing has. I've been trying to get the information downloaded of what this ship is and anything and everything about it that I can actually get. They were talking about well, we would call them back in the Apollo days, from Mercury to Apollo, reaction control systems. Basically, they would release gas of sorts to maneuver the ship. Now, granted, when you're dealing with a similar design to the Apollo space program, from Mercury over to the Apollo, you're flying a cylindrical spam in a can, basically, through space. And in order to maneuver the ship to where you want it to go, it's one thing having main thrusters in the back, but you still need to have a reactionary control system to guide the ship, to sail the ship, basically, through space. Which means a little puff here, a little puff there, a little puff there, a little puff there, and you can actually maneuver the ship. The Falcon with the Dragon capsule actually has that capability of the SpaceX. Boeing was trying to do with Starliner, trying to keep up and trying to debut and make spectacular of its own ship. And I think they needed more test runs on this thing, but they were coming up for cost overruns on this one. I mean, it looks fantastic on paper, and in reality, it looked pretty fantastic. But this was a maiden voyage of a ship manned going over to the International Space Station. There's a lot of speculations. There's a lot of controversy over this ship, whether or not it was space worthy or not, and whether or not if the systems were working or not. If I'm not mistaken, they were still trying to test those systems out on Earth, but very primitive when they started out with the Mercury missions. Shepard was the first one to go up. This was a race to the moon. Granted, the whole space race between the 1960s through the 70s was just basically being first at something, trying to show the Russians, but they were also dead serious about sending people into space, about living in space, building a moon space, and trying to project a future. As long as they had public funding and public support. But apparently, cost overruns and public support were waning during the Apollo program. That's why they had to shut it down. I mean, they had to think about 17 missions. 11, 12, 14, 15, and 16. My question, did they have 17? Probably they had 17. Let's see. Well, concerning about the Apollo space program here, going back over to Wick on this one here, I just wanted to get how many missions did we actually have during that time? I know the costs were exorbitant. I know they were exorbitant at this point. 17. Okay, cool. That's what I wanted to find out. So, 11 was the first landing. Then there was 12. And then there was 14, 15, 16, 17. So basically, 6 craft landed on the moon, made their debuts. Most of them were scientific in nature. But the first one was just getting the first footprint on the moon. To do so, they needed special equipment for this. They needed a spacecraft that was maneuverable in space. And yes, they did launch a few test ships up into the atmosphere. They were going to use Apollo 1 for it, but people forgot. There were 3 astronauts killed in the plugs out test. Plugging up the spacecraft, popping it with 100% oxygen in there, just to see if it was going to be holding, and if it was going to be holding that air without bursting seams, then they would have a craft to fly into space. Apparently, there was some defaults in the manufacturing that caused it. So Grumman aided on that one. Kind of sucked. But there were a lot of things happening in the Apollo space program that astronauts were dying not because of the spacecraft, but test pilots dealing with adverse reactions and things happening. I do not want to put a downer or put a blanket on it, because these guys were going to be going to the moon if they lived. But apparently fate had decided otherwise. That being said, Boeing at this point was going to be taking a shot on this one. They were going to be sending out their own craft, into space on this one. They're already having issues regarding aircraft. They're already getting into controversies left and right. These guys were separate, and Boeing was only focusing on aerospace, and had merged with McDonnell Douglas back in '97. If I'm not mistaken, Douglas is also part of the space program. Aerospace. Let me see. Douglas Aircraft. Maybe not. I just wanted to see. No, just hold on. Here we go. I thought they were part of it. Okay. Part of the Gemini program. I call it Big Gemini. Oh. They were going to have a spacecraft of their own, but it didn't work out too well. But they were part of the Skylab program, America's first space station, using parts from the Saturn V that they would convert the fuselage into living quarters and laboratory experiments. They would have 3 crews living on it. It was going to be temporary at best. It may have been an ugly-looking bird, but man, I loved that. I loved her. She was a good-looking ship. Meanwhile, back in the ranch, Boeing was still trying to get their dream of getting a spacecraft up in the air. They were pouring billions into this one. Now, because of the space transportation system decommissioned, probably public and funding. It's usually the two things that tear things apart, but also high maintenance costs. It's very costly of maintaining at least one space shuttle, let alone about 4 or 5 other ships. And they already lost 2 in the program. They would have called them a failures right there. And they probably were failures. Challenger and Columbia. Nobody during that time foresaw that an O-ring, once it's flash frozen and thawed out quickly, that it would develop cracks that will enable gas from a solid rocket booster's ignition to allow the whole entire spacecraft to blow apart. Nobody foresaw that one. They probably called that a catastrophic failure right there. It took them about 1.5 or 2 for the shuttle system to get back in operation again. And they also had to have hearings on it. And the information's out there on the internet for that. And also for the Columbia Space Shuttle burning up in the atmosphere in pieces. When the ship launched originally, it lost several tiles, which enabled a zipper effect to happen when the space shuttle hit the atmosphere. And that caused hot gases to go through and tear the ship apart. Literally in space, literally in the sky. So getting back to the Starliner, I think I talked about this one once before. The ship needs maneuvering thrusters to pitch and yaw to guide the ship where it needs to go to. While there be main thrusters in the back to propel it forward, you still need thrusters to angle it in any direction to force the ship go. If you want some kind of a visualization at this point, you ever played video games? When you're maneuvering ships, it's usually by a joystick, right? The joystick would be controlling the icon on the screen of what the ship was going to be going up, down, sideways. Well, think of that ship as a 3-dimensional ship right in front of you. And it's got thrusters, little tiny thrusters, but powerful gas jets in them. And this would maneuver the ship to go crazy. I mean, you've seen space shows, you've seen other things that flying through space or flying through the atmosphere. In the atmosphere, we would have ailerons, we would have elevators, we would have rudder controls to maneuver a flying craft through the atmosphere. But in space, you don't have that. In space, it's vacuum. It is devoid. It is a void. It is a. It's undefinable in a point, but it's basically a vacuum that you would need gas jets to maneuver the ship wherever it needs to go. They hadn't tested it out, at least not in my knowledge, of any other space flights other than the one they popped off with 2 people in it. They should have just popped it off, or at least popped off as test one that they actually had, to see if it was going to work or not. I know SpaceX had been doing that with their own ships. Boeing wanted to do it in a different way. They wanted the first time show saying that they are on top of everything. And no, they're not. They are embarrassed. When they actually discussed ideas of having another company salvaging their astronauts, that does put a black mark on Boeing at this point, despite the fact that they're also having controversies regarding their aircraft. So I don't know if they're going to be able to eat this as public relations nightmare or not, but I think they would. But even if that's the case, people are thinking, oh well, they can't get a spaceship up there. Well, management decision at this point has put them in a delicate position, in a delicate spot here. If the ship was allowed to go up in the atmosphere just by robot control, just pop it off, see if it goes up in space, and come back out. I mean, maybe they would do that. If they had atmospheric test conditions happening on Earth, I know it's under sea level and it's under enough atmospheric pressure laying on top of it. It's not void, but they would still need to test the craft out one way or another, which means tearing the thing apart, testing out all the jets on the test ship, and seeing if it can actually maneuver or not. But in order for them to know that one, I know they needed to put people up there. I think it was also a bad position for them to send a ship over to the International Space Station. But it's a good lifeboat. Just going to be a long time for the astronauts to get back home. I know the plan was simple. It was supposed to be just launch the ship, dock with the space station, hang out for about a week or two, come back home, get your publicity shots. That was the basic plan. Didn't go too well because of systems issues. And also, every time they keep making these kind of spacecraft, they don't make it accessible for space engineers to go into them. I talked about this one a long time ago on my own series, my own channel, concerning about there should have been engineers. There should have. I mean, a test pilot's in one thing, but there should have been engineers. I'm trying to get rid of a damn bug. I've got bugware all over that damn place. We just got sprayed yesterday. We just got sprayed, and they're still coming out of the woodworks. Bastards. They gotten used to the chem shower. A chem bath they gave them. Anyway, there's a lot of things I was going to say about this one. I just got into a blank spot there. Sorry about that, guys. There had been pushback in the independent media, not to mention the corporate media, but not much on the corporate media because they've been focusing more on the politics, what's happening. But in the realm of aerospace, even aircraft having issues does affect the stock market, and it does affect everybody else left and right. You get out of here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bastard bug. It's driving me crazy. Public relations is a nightmare when it comes down for large corporations. They always want to make sure that they've got the best possible profile in order to keep attracting new investors into their company, to keep increasing the stock worthiness of the company, and make sure that they're going to get enough payback, or actually enough dividends for the stockholders and the shareholders at this point. But something as costly as this, they wanted to make sure that they had this right, and they had to test this thing out like crazy. That's why it took them so long of building this thing for months. But also keep this in mind, and I have to keep throwing history at the back of these people's faces on this one here. It took them almost 10 years of getting the Apollo program up and running, but we had to actually have other companies building ships. We had government sponsored during those times. We had taxpayer money paying for a lot of things. This is private corporations. SpaceX was showing people through their own initiative, their own understanding of aerospace, of spacecraft design, not to mention borrowing some things that they learned from back then, just the fundamental principles, what they needed to create their own ship. Not to mention they're still working on their own uh, huge spacecraft. They still want to land on the moon. We're still waiting for the Artemis program that NASA still commissioned, trying to get that program going on so they can get going to the moon. So we have these commercial venues going on. Boeing wanted to be one of the major competitors going against SpaceX at this point. And people need to see what the commercial advantage is. What's the commercial attraction for the ship? What is it that makes space travel fun? Now, granted, we would be saying the same thing of sea travel. What makes an ocean adventure fun? Well, tall tales for one. Maybe something to entice the imagination a little bit. If a person went on a cruise these days, it's almost no problem. Been on a ship, stable enough, but they still have to deal with the unknown elements out there. The ocean is one unknown element. Even though ships sail on it like crazy, aircraft fly over it, submarines go under it, but they're all knowing that there is an unknown element of going into this environment. There is still a challenge for sailing ships on top of the water and submarines going through the water. Cargo ships have to face it. They have to face human issues all the time. But they also have to deal with sea life and also the turbulent waters as well, and the wind. In space, we are dealing with a hostile environment, dealing with radiation, micrometeors, human junk in space. We're dealing with a vacuum. We're dealing with a void that has no place for you to suck up oxygen because it's a void. It's an environment that is deadliest to human beings if they are exposed to it. They can't breathe because it takes out the oxygen. It's so cold, its lack of heat, that you're frozen. And it has radiation deadly out there. Unless, of course, you're biologically attuned to the radiation and it's sucking it up like crazy, so maybe you can live in the damn thing. But we have to have layers of material to shield us from the radiation, from the cold. But if we happen to get into contact with the sun, it also heats up. So there's also heat, form of nuclear energy coming out from the sun, energetic protons and atoms and stuff. And they add heat. But the heat still just disintegrates, or just evaporates. But the planets do suck up as much as they can. Earth is in a position in space where, as it rotates and goes across, orbits the sun, it rotates. It's on a tilted axis. So it's able to draw upon solar energy to give our planet life, change our environment a great deal. The environment we're dealing with is a spacecraft that has to maneuver through the system. And it has to have working mechanisms. The thing is, what I never could understand is that every time they kept sending astronauts out, I know they are capable of trying to fix a space station. They gave them just enough general knowledge to fix the space station. Or maybe fix the space shuttle when it was working. But did they ever think of having an engineer with a test pilot to fly up in the spacecraft, and if they actually had any problems, could they go outside doing an EVA walk and do the repair work right there? No, because they're not that sophisticated just yet. They can do that on the space stations. They have the engineering degree for it. The mechanical need, the mechanical necessity to fix whatever is broken on that thing. But they couldn't do that for the Starliner. So that's another publicity thing that they still have to think about. But they still want to get their ship back in one piece. They need to. So they have to pop it off without anybody in it. Hopefully that the remote guidance will force the ship to land where they want it to land. Somewhere soft. Most of the time, actually all the time when it came down for the Mercury, the Gemini, and the Apollo space program, as I said before, we actually had the military involved in this one. We had the government paying for everything, which meant we had military assistance on this one. We had recovery vessels. We had radars tracking this thing. And they usually landed in the water. Except for one ship that sunk. Sorry, guys. But this, we're talking about a company. Since the United States had gotten out of it entirely, I mean fully funded, but now partially funding programs, they don't have a program by themselves. Not building ships by themselves. I mean, other corporations doing it, but under the NASA thing. But it's not like government sponsored entirely, where they have to have government oversight. The companies have their own oversight on the situation, but they still have liaisons through NASA to see if the spacecraft are worthy enough and are they able to be flown without having any issues or difficulties. And this is the challenge that they're facing with the Starliner, because they made a decision of putting the two astronauts on the space station and waiting for another company to pick them up. I know it's a publicity nightmare. It's a nightmare. But saves two lives. They're going to try to do something to salvage it as much as they can. And if or when they get the ship back in one piece, they're going to take them weeks to months to find out what the hell happened and can they get it fixed. Is it salvageable? Do they have another backup ship working? See, this is the thing concerning about redundancy. In the Mercury program, they didn't have the redundancy. They didn't think about it at the time. But they were still trying to think about safety. In the Gemini program, they were still thinking about redundancies, but trying not to endanger anybody else in the program. Apollo had to bring a shock value to them. So now they still have to have redundant ships ready to rock and roll. It was a good thing that we actually had the space shuttle program going on. We did have redundancies. We had 7 shuttles. The first one was just a test, not space worthy. I mean, it could have been, but it didn't make it that way. Just aerodynamic enough just to do testing throughout the atmosphere and landing and stuff. But it could have been. We could have had an Enterprise ship out there, a space shuttle. That would have been something. And it costed billions of just getting one shuttle after another, after another, after another. They never did actually have a situation where they actually had two shuttles going up, one right after the other. It would have been something to see. But it would have been something like an emergency situation if one shuttle was actually having an issue. They could have just transferred to another shuttle, but they didn't think about it at that time. If they did, they didn't think it was cost effective or something else. So in that decision, I think they screwed up on regarding Columbia. Boeing hasn't thought of the same damn thing here. Because if they actually had at least two or three more ships, instead of relying on the one, they would have redundancy. But it cost the company that much more money. And how much credit do they have in order to do that one? But you have to understand the mechanisms concerning about space travel. It's not the easiest thing to take a ship into the atmosphere, let alone have it fly through the atmosphere. I've still been trying to find if they actually have anything online about the what the engineering specs are on this thing. I would love to see that. And where were the malfunctioning thrusters are? Were they accessible? I mean, could it have been accessible in space? Would have been able to do that? They have artistic impressions online. Doing a Yahoo search on this, I'm seeing certain things that they actually have for artistic. But the one thing I really wanted to see is the mechanism of it. I'm not an engineer, but one can always learn from some of the stuff. I understand how the system works. Because this is important, guys. They have to understand the what was the process, what stopped it from doing what it was supposed to be doing. What was the cause for the malfunctions? In fact, if I'm not mistaken, there was a Gemini mission that was almost in failure. There was a docking of an Aegean spacecraft, a test ship that enabled the astronauts to link up with it in Earth orbit. A necessary step in order for the Apollo program to work, because they would have to link up the lunar lander to the Apollo service capsule. And they needed the skills for that. So they were learning the skills in Gemini on that. There was a problem with one of the RC units, reaction control systems. And if I'm not mistaken, Armstrong was in charge of that mission. Armstrong was in charge of that mission. Managed to save the ship, but he had to put something on automatic, and that kind of canceled things out. If he was actually able to fix it just by doing controls or maybe a reset or something, maybe. But putting it on automatic saved fuel, saved the ship, screwed up the mission. It wasn't a complete failure, but it was a command decision. What Boeing has done is not considered a failure. Not entirely. They didn't lose the craft. They didn't lose the astronauts. Not yet, anyway. So, this being told to the independent medias out there, give them a break. Give Boeing a break. If they can figure this one out without trying to kill anybody in the process, consider it a win. They have to work on the public information image. They have to work on that. So spin is going to be the thing they're going to be working on like crazy just to salvage their company. But consider this. If the ship comes back in pieces, Then you can give them a rash. Then you can give them a Razzie on that one. At least I haven't killed anybody in there yet.